Hi, I'm Mark Rabin. Welcome to episode 380 of the Lean Blog Interviews podcast. This episode is different. I would say it's special because it's being released during a special week on leanblog.org. So I've handed over the blog to Deondra Wardelle. She is a lean professional like myself. She's a Black woman, unlike myself. And she's invited and recruited a number of guest authors who are writing posts all this week on themes of continuous improvement and what Deondra is calling hashtag root cause racism. So these posts are going to be appearing through August 14th. Deondra and I are going to be hosting a panel webinar discussion on these themes. So you can find all of this by going to leanblog.org/RCR or leanblog.org/root cause racism. So the only thing I'm publishing on the blog this week is this podcast. And I'm very, very pleased to be joined by Dr. Randal Pinkett and Dr. Jeffrey Robinson. So I want to tell you about each of them. Randal Pinkett is an entrepreneur. He's a speaker. He's an author and community servant. He's a co-founder, chairman, and CEO of his fifth venture called BCT Partners, a multimillion-dollar management, technology, and policy consulting firm in Newark, New Jersey. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He was a college athlete, and he holds 5 academic degrees from Rutgers, Oxford, and MIT. One of those degrees at MIT is from a program I attended, the Leaders for Global Operations program, and Randal was a student there a year before me. So he has a BS in electrical engineering. He has a Ph.D. in media arts and sciences from the MIT Media Lab. And you may recognize the name, or you may definitely recognize his face, because he was the first and the only Black winner of the TV show The Apprentice. So we will get some of Randal's thoughts on that during today's episode. And we're joined by Randal's co-author, Jeffrey Robinson. He's an award-winning business school professor, international speaker, and entrepreneur. Since 2008, he's been a leading faculty member at Rutgers Business School, where he's an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship and the founding assistant director of the Center for Urban Entrepreneurship and Economic Development. He has a MS from Georgia Tech in civil engineering management and a PhD in management from Columbia University. And together, they are the authors of the book, Black Faces in White Places. So that's going to be the core for a lot of our discussion today, talking about the book, talking about what organizations can and should do today and in the future. And also want to mention their upcoming book, Black Faces in High Places. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. If you want to find links to more information about both of my guests, Dr. Randal Pinkett and Dr. Jeffrey Robinson, you can go to leanblog.org/380. Well, again, we are joined today by Dr. Randal Pinkett and Dr. Jeffrey Robinson. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, we have a lot I'd like to explore today, and the two of you, of course, as the authors of your book, Black Faces and White Places. I was wondering if first, if I can ask each of you to explore a little bit. A question around, as you discussed in the book, is America colorblind? I find a lot of people, particularly white people, like to say things like, I don't see color. Is America colorblind at this point?
Well, I'll take the first swing at the plate here and say that America is absolutely not colorblind. Let's be unequivocally clear. It is not. And the issue is that many people are duped into believing that color blindness is somehow aspirational, as if that's where they should aspire to be, or if they've arrived there, that they're in a good place and now they need not go anywhere else. Whereas we would argue that not only do we want you to see color, because of its beauty, because of the diversity, because of the celebration of color. But we don't want you to also fall victim to the ancillary conclusions one might draw if you really believe colorblindness is the goal. But you might believe that the workplace is a meritocracy, that everyone's treated fairly, that we only hire the best and brightest, that everyone has equal opportunity to succeed. But then I ask you to look at the data. The data will tell you that at managerial levels, executive levels, C-suite boards, African Americans are grossly underrepresented, which means somebody's seeing color because people are being denied opportunity based on their color. And whether that is explicit, that you are intentionally discriminatory or prejudiced and the like, or implicit, meaning it is you're well-intentioned, but your actions belie your intentions and the impact is otherwise. Either way, the end result is the same.
Jeff?
Yeah, I'd only add one or two things to that. I mean, every research study that looks into these things just shows the preponderance of evidence, as the lawyers like to say, that there is bias in many different systems. I mean, all kinds of institutions, and of course, we've focused a lot of our work on the business world and thinking about how the business world is impacted by these implicit and sometimes not implicit, sometimes explicit bias. There's a real strength in diversity. So to be colorblind, doesn't allow us as a society to really appreciate and respect the peoples who are coming to the table. And there's an authenticity we can all bring when we know that our diversity is really a strength.
And when you mentioned look at the data and you look at outcomes, which are measurable, undeniable, the question then traces back to the causes of inequity in outcomes. What are your thoughts on organizations today? Has explicit bias been sort of pushed underneath the surface and replaced with more implicit bias in terms of like people have learned not to say overtly racist things? Does that then lead to a more hidden or insidious form of bias?
Well, it certainly can. It certainly can. And I mean, just, the classic examples are in recruiting. You're talking about who you're going to hire. And there's been several studies that have just done the name associations and biases that come straight out of what our impressions or our thoughts are about a particular person's name. Oh, that person must be of that ethnic background. And then what happens in the back of a person's mind is, well, is that somebody I want to work with? Maybe not. Well, again, the other evidence is that where people live, we often live in very segregated neighborhoods, or said it differently, we live in neighborhoods with people just like us, whatever just like us is, whatever that means to you. And so you bring to the table some of these biases when we look at resumes, when we are recruiting, where we go to recruit, how we ask questions, how we interact with people in terms of microaggression. So all of that factors into it. And a lot of the work that Randal and I and others are doing is to try to re-engineer that for companies, help them to see those biases and to uncover them, because they just reinforce patterns that what we have said in society is that these are not patterns we want to replicate. But then we see it, and we continue to see it. And then we see tragic things that happen, like George Floyd and other things. So these are the kinds of insidious patterns we're trying to break.
And Randal, you were nodding pretty vigorously. What would you like to add?
No, nothing to add. I think Dr. Robinson, I think Jeff spoke perfectly to the question.
Yeah, and as a follow-up, you talk about recruiting. And I mean, it seems like some companies in, let's say, for example, Silicon Valley, have come to realize that the idea of hiring for what they would call cultural fit ends up being a really bad idea for different reasons in terms of hiring people who are like you, people who come from the same background as you. Can you talk a little bit, either of you talk about that dynamic and why it's important for companies to try to break some of that cycle, or how they can go about that?
Yeah, there's a think, a social psychological principle called homophily. And homophily is the idea that we are naturally drawn to people who are like us. It's human, it's natural. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with that tendency. You think of the old adage, birds of a feather flock together. But it does become problematic when we have an inability to connect with people who aren't like us. That's when it becomes problematic. When we only, and in corporations, and we've seen this in our work at BCT, certain departments, certain roles, certain functions, certain levels begin to get stereotyped for people with certain profiles, certain schools, certain ethnicities, certain genders, and you can get into engineering versus executive suite versus managers versus finance, and the list goes on, and how we can get caught in these patterns of association of who is a good, to your point, Mark, which I thought was a good one, who's the right cultural fit. Very subjective, very easily very easy to overlook those who traditionally may not fit the stereotype. And so that's why we advocate more formal measures of ensuring that there's diversity of perspective and diversity of who's being considered. So we talk about diverse panels for interviews. So you have people who can look at the candidates from different angles, different perspectives, but also having diverse panels of who's being interviewed, so that we can ensure that no one's being overlooked and no one is falling victim to what can be akin to groupthink when we think about who's qualified and who's not.
So, in the book, Black Faces in White Places, one thing that struck me as a white face is the privilege, if not the luxury, of thinking of places. It's very rare, I think, of professional circumstances when I have been the only white face in the room. So, in the book, you talk about the burden of being, a company's Jackie Robinson, the first Black person in a certain role or first Black person in the organization. Can you share? Can maybe each of you share a story about that to help us understand that perspective?
Yeah, it's to be the only one or the first one, and I can think of several situations where in 2020, the Wharton School of Business has its first woman as dean, who's also an African American, also the first African American. It's 2020, and there are certainly other schools, sort of in the upper echelon of business schools that haven't even achieved that yet. And it's 2020; they're the first person. And I know Dr. Erica James, very well, and I know the interesting thing about who she is and what she's able to accomplish. I know she's a fantastic candidate, and this is not her first deanship. But I also know that when we talk to people who've been in similar situations and we reflect on our own experience, we think about these four dimensions of of what we call the Black faces and white places experience. And some of it has to do with your identity. Who am I in this situation? And how do I position myself? It's about meritocracy. It's wondering the question: are people looking at me, and are they going to give me the benefit of the doubt like they would everybody else? Are they going to give me and judge me on my merits? It's about this colorblindness we were talking about before, whether society or the people you're interacting with is going to be colorblind, or are they going to be really color brave, which, to steal a phrase from Melanie Hobson. And then there's opportunity. Where are my opportunities? Do I have the same opportunities as everybody else? I mean, it's kind of an interesting dynamic where you are thinking about these things and maybe not even articulating them, but you're thinking about it. And while you're doing that, you're also trying to, achieve the goals you have for your professional life. It's a lot of work, a lot of mental work that goes on often to be the first one or the one of a few in a situation like that.
Yeah, no, and I may tell a story other than my own, because I think it's actually more powerful than my own. But I will say, that part of the impetus for the book Black Faces in White Places was that Jeffrey's experience and my experience is that we've been Black faces in white places for the majority of our lives, growing up in predominantly white neighborhoods, going to predominantly white public schools, going to Rutgers University, where we were a handful of African Americans in the engineering school, and then for him, Columbia, Georgia Tech. For me, MIT, Oxford. List goes on. But I remember when Jeff and I were involved with the National Society of Black Engineers. Jeff ran the national convention, and one of the speakers we brought in was Dr. Mae Jameson, who was the first African American woman to go into outer space, also an engineer. And she told this story about how when she was young, she would tell people that she had this dream of going into outer space. And they would tell her, what makes you think that they're going to let a brown girl go into outer space? But the beauty of her story was, getting back to this idea of being modern day Jackie Robinson's, was that she never listened to the naysayers. And that's part of that's the flip side of being underrepresented, is that you may not see examples or role models who have blazed the trail. And so, you're it. You're the one to set the example. And while that's challenging, it also, in some ways, is very empowering because it allows others to be inspired. And I know her remarks that day inspired me to say, well, if that brown girl from the 60s could go into outer space in the 80s, then I need to make sure I step up my game for the 90s and into the new millennium.
Jeff, could you elaborate a little bit more on you use the phrase color brave and kind of help contrast that to being colorblind?
Yeah. So Melody Hobson from Ariel Capital kind of made this phrase in a TED talk that she was talking about, and she pointed out what you did earlier, which is to be colorblind doesn't help the situation. That just ignores what's out there, and it ignores a lot of things. But to be color brave has to do with thinking about how all of these colors can come together, valuing the tapestry, the rainbow, whatever metaphor you want to use and sort of fit in there. But it is how you will acknowledge and respect and engage with the wonderful colors that are in front of you. But Randal talks about this one a lot. Maybe he should add some more to it.
Well, it's an inspiring TED talk. I just produced my own video, Candid Conversations with a Black Businessman, which is it's on YouTube, and I reference Melody's TED talk in that video. And to me, the big takeaway is not shying away from bold conversations about race. And I've found in this moment, the post George Floyd era, as it were, that I find Black people have become more emboldened, but I have found whites to have become more reserved, afraid of engaging in conversation for fear of saying the wrong thing or being labeled a racist or being judged or putting their foot in their mouth. The list goes on. So, I want to just call out, Mark, and just applaud you for reaching out to us to have this conversation. I don't know whether it was a comfortable place for you to go or not, but I commend you for going there regardless, to have this dialogue.
Well, I'm in the midst of facing those fears and trying to work through them, because I think and I think we often want to say, well, we want to treat people fairly, but that doesn't mean glossing over differences in culture. And in the book, you talk about, I was wondering if you explore, the kind of pressure to fit in to a predominant culture, which is a white culture, while still staying true to your own identity. And I think, I'll as a white person, I think there's always that fear of like, well, if celebrating difference runs the risk of like, oh my gosh, I don't want to say something that's a stereotype or something that's offensive. Can you talk a little bit more about that dynamic of staying true to yourself versus working to fit in or changing the culture?
Yeah, the book, as you know, is the work product of our lived experience, but also having interviewed dozens of other African Americans who have succeeded in their respective fields, corporate America, entrepreneurship, faith-based, nonprofit, education, and ask them, how did you make it to the top and not lose a sense of who you are? And there's these 10, what we call game-changing strategies that are cumulative. Each strategy builds upon the next, meaning that strategy one is what we found to be the most foundational, the most foremost, the most fundamental strategy of all 10. And you just touched on it, Mark. It is about establishing a strong identity and purpose. And the idea here is when you are underrepresented and you don't see reflections of yourself and you see the predominant culture around you, the proclivity can be to adopt the culture, the norms of the majority. You're the only African American, you act like white. You're the only woman, you act more male. You're the only immigrant, you try to adopt American mores. And our argument is that if you want to succeed, rather than seek to assimilate, although we all have to manage our ability to get in where we fit in, but rather know that holding on to who you are, your identity, and knowing what direction you're going, your purpose, are going to give you the best shot at success, because your identity is what grounds you. It's your anchor. And your purpose is your compass. It guides you. That when stereotypes come, or low expectations come, or even racism or discrimination comes, without knowing who you are and where you're going, you're like a leaf in the wind. They say you can't do it, you believe them. They tried to deny you, you allow it to happen. You aren't grounded or guided from a sense of purposefulness and strength that can help you to overcome those challenges. And most importantly, 20, 30 years later in your career, you can still look in the mirror and be proud of the person that you see.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and here's how it intersects a lot with corporations and corporate America. The coping strategy of many people of color, Black people included, is to bring a facade to work. You bring a version of yourself to work, and that's the one that is interacting with your colleagues. That's not a very authentic approach, right? It doesn't bring your authentic self into the workplace. And so, there's two ways to look at this. So some people will say, okay, well, that's just how it is in a corporation. I got to bring my mask of the corporation, and I'm going to act a certain way and interact in a certain way. And no doubt, every company has this culture, and there's some adaptation. And perhaps everybody does this to a certain extent. I would argue that many people of color do it more than everybody else because their authentic self, their culture that they bring sort of from their life, often is in it's either in conflict or in some cases, just not rewarded, just not acknowledged, just not thought of as being part of the executive presence or whatever it is that people say these days. So, there's a lot of thought work that goes into that. And while you're trying to figure that out, you're also supposed to do your job. So what other workplaces have figured out is, can we allow our employees to bring their authentic self, or as much as they feel comfortable with? And they find that when people are able to bring their authentic self, they can relax and perform in higher levels because they're not doing a lot of this sort of extra work to think and rethink how they're going to say something, and that's a new way of thinking. I mean, the corporation of the 70s and 80s was you suit up, you come in, and you take on the persona of whatever the company man or woman is. And what we're seeing and hoping in some cases in 2020 is that companies are starting to see that forcing people to conform in those ways has detrimental effects in the long run.
And I'll admit that until recently, I had not thought much about the phrase white privilege or the reality of that. And I think as you're describing it, the privilege or the luxury of not being distracted from my own work and attempts at progressing in my career by those thoughts of, am I being given a fair shot because of the color of my skin? Am I fitting in? Do I feel like I'm, do people feel like I belong here? And I'm just thinking back to college when I was doing an internship at one of the automakers outside of Detroit. And one of the other engineering interns who was black, he told a couple of us, the rest of us were white, so I think he was very much a black face in a white place. Over lunch, telling us a story about how he cut off his dreadlocks before he came and interviewed for the job because he feared that wouldn't be seen as professional. Now, this was over 25 years ago, but I can't imagine that's gone away.
Yeah. Certainly in some places it hasn't. And that's an example. The whole discussion of hair for men, but for the longest time it was a conversation focused on women in the workplace, especially women of color. What hairdo do I bring to work? And then people, focusing a lot of more attention on you because of your hair or your appearance. And yeah, there are people who've written about this for sure, talking about how they have to navigate a completely different situation from the time you leave your home to getting to work, and how do I look, and how does this look fit into the corporate norm? And so, back to white privilege. White privilege is, well, I don't even have to think about that. I just go in and be who I am. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, who you are is reflected in everything around you inside of the company, or for that matter, society. And so that means that you don't have to worry about hair or how you look or how people are going to perceive you if you contradict them or other things. That is, that's the way that things are. Mm-hmm. And so it's everybody else who has to come in and do it. And so that's why in this moment in 2020, we are, all focusing more attention on what does inclusion mean? How do we reduce the levels of white privilege in our companies so that we can engage everyone in their authentic place and get the highest performance in order for us to achieve our goals.
You mentioned earlier, Jeff, you talked about the dynamic of someone being the first Black man to reach a certain position or the first Black woman. And I wanted to ask a question about something I see as kind of a disturbing pattern on LinkedIn where, for one, I'll see a headline where I think my reaction is, oh, well, good, great. Congratulations, it's about time. We see, the first Black woman hired as such and such. And then the inevitable triggering of other white people who jump in with comments, varying degrees of rudeness. So like, well, why does that matter? And shouldn't it just say, so-and-so got hired, just use her name. And why do we have to point that out? I mean, what, thoughts, do you have thoughts on why that's necessary to call out and celebrate when somebody is the first to reach a certain position, even how many years since Jackie Robinson? Baseball. There are still these firsts. Why is that worth calling out and celebrating?
Yeah, it's a great point, and certainly it goes back to the conversation about colorblindness. Some people don't want to see color, so it offends them in some way that we're acknowledging that somebody is the first. When Randal and I have talked about this before, part of it is certainly about signaling to the public, hey, we are an inclusive company. But there's a part of me that also says, well, why did it take so long? It's 2020. Right. Randal, I know you like this subject. Go ahead.
Well, I hasten to echo your comments, Jeffrey. It is absolutely rooted and connected to the myth of color blindness, and it is important. We believe to celebrate and to highlight these accomplishments because of the exact example I gave earlier from Dr. Mae Jameson, that these are both signs of progress and signs of hope. signs that we've made progress in our society, like when we celebrated Barack Obama's election. And I was proud in that moment to see that, every news outlet that I turned to, regardless of their partisanship, celebrated the moment of what it meant for our country. And in an equal measure, because there are still hurdles we haven't overcome, there's still barriers that remain standing, and there are proverbial glass ceilings that have yet to be shattered, the struggle continues. And, I want to know that University of Pennsylvania hired a Black woman as their dean for their business school, because now I know University of Pennsylvania has sent a message to me that in that moment and through that measure, they are more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable, and more a sense of belonging, by my estimation, than they were before. That's a sign of progress and a sign of hope.
So, Randal, when you talk about being the first, I was going to ask this, so I'll go ahead and segue to it. You were, I think, quite famously the first and only, as it turned out, Black winner on The Apprentice. And you were treated very differently as the winner. I kind of invite you to tell the story, if you don't mind, about what happened and some of the dynamics of why you were treated differently than the other winners.
So I should mention that it's fresh on my mind because my daughter found the episodes of the show online, and we ended up watching the entire season together, which was a fascinating way of reliving the experience through the eyes of someone who wasn't even born when it happened.
That's right.
Wow. And you probably haven't watched it yourself in a very long time.
Not from end to end. I've seen snippets, but not from the beginning to the very end. I really enjoyed the journey. But to your question, there were 7 seasons of The Apprentice, 6 where there were white winners, and then 1 where I was the winner. I'm the only person of any color to have won on The Apprentice. And I was season 4, so I was right in the middle of the run of The Apprentice. And after I was hired, and for those who are listening and watching who aren't familiar with the show, it's 18 business people who compete every week on a task. There's a losing team, someone's fired, all the way down to the final 2, live television. Jeff was in the audience, Lincoln Center, 14 million people. I was hired in that moment. And without getting into too much detail of my performance against my adversaries, which was not equally matched, moments after being hired, I was asked, Randal, do you want to share the title with the white female runner-up? And my thoughts then are quite proudly my thoughts now. It was insulting. It was a moment where people asked, well, let me cut ahead. So my response was, no, if there's going to be a winner tonight, there's going to only be one, and it's going to be me. That was my response. I know that because I just watched the episode just recently. But then people kept asking, well, why didn't you share, Randal? Why didn't you do the magnanimous thing and share? My response is, no. Not why didn't I share? Why did he ask the question?
Right.
In the first place, if there were 3 whites before me who were not asked to share, and there were 3 whites after me who were not asked to share, why am I being asked to share? And so the question is not on me, the question's on him. Right. And I would argue that in 2020, we had the benefit of hindsight being 2020, no pun intended, 2020, that it was only a harbinger, my estimation, of things to come from the man who would now occupy the White House, that he didn't want to see me as the sole and single winner. And my message that night is my message today. It was my message to my daughter. And I said this to her in that moment after she watched it and said, why did he do it? I said, well, let me tell you what. Know this. When you've earned the victory, don't be afraid to claim the victory. And I claim what I rightfully earned.
Well, those were the rules of the game. My wife and I watched every episode of that season. We were cheering for you. I mean, I claim, MIT connections, and I'd only met you briefly at school, but that was a powerful connection, and we were rooting for you. And anyway, but thinking back to along the way, did you feel like was that? I mean, that moment was surprising, but were there kind of biases or mistreatment, that prejudice, that came out along the way during those different weeks of those competitions or in boardroom moments?
It's a great question. And the mechanics of the filming of The Apprentice is that we actually have very little contact with Donald during the filming, because he is largely there to announce the task, go away, come back, tell you who won, go away. And only if you lose do you then see him again in the boardroom. And as the winner, I didn't see him much in the boardroom. So I didn't have much substantive contact with Donald during the filming of the show. And so the answer to that question is actually no. Although I did hear the rumors leading up to the finale that he was considering asking me to share, or that he might consider a double hiring. And Jeff knows, because we prepared, he and I and our executive team at BCT, for the various scenarios, including close to the one that unfolded. But then I worked for the Trump organization after I won, and there I began to see a different side. And to our whole conversation, I was the only person of color in any executive capacity for my entire year in the Trump organization. And Donald at the time had some order of 30 companies under his umbrella, many of which are now gone and defunct. But I met many of the executives who ran those companies, mostly white men. And so it said something to me about, does or does not Donald value diversity? Does he value equity? Does he value inclusion? And as the guy who he asked to share, does he value me? And I can only draw the conclusion from his pattern then and now that the answer was no. The answer was no.
It's interesting to think about that being a prize. I mean, I'm sure it was an education that was maybe not what you were hoping to get when you first applied to be on the show.
The prize was education. Yeah.
No, and I have no regrets. I mean, I had a great run on the show. It opened doors. People hear me talk critically about Donald as if I'm not appreciative of what The Apprentice has done for me. No, quite the contrary. I am very appreciative of what The Apprentice has done for me. We wouldn't be having this conversation were it not for The Apprentice. But I have to be true to myself and say that I can be appreciative of the door that was opened, but also be critical of the person who opened the door. And that's the juxtaposition where I find myself. So it was a great prize, opportunity, platform, however we term it. But I'm also critical of Donald in the same vein, as we all have our work to do. Lord knows Donald has his own work to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jeff, what are your recollections of some of that scenario planning or trying to anticipate what was going to happen there?
Oh yeah. It was a serious effort. We had to kind of play out different scenarios, different situations that could happen, and try to anticipate the reaction. And the reality is, we knew that if he answered the way he actually did, there'd be some blowback. There'd be some people out there who would not like the fact that he didn't share or whatever. And we said, okay, well, we're willing to Randal, are you willing to take on that heat? To stand on principle, and he was, and I'm glad that he was. But yeah, there was a robust group of folks out there who were very antagonistic towards Randal in that moment. And again, just watching the whole thing happen live is amazing. As you already know, we start the book with the whole conversation about how, as Randal described it, how it all went down, and that became an organizing, kind of story for the beginning of our book. And it's been a few years since we've written it now. And I'll tell you the truth. I thought that when we wrote the book, I thought, we've got President Obama in here. Things are getting better. By the time my children are old enough to read this book, it won't even be that necessary. Let's just say I was wrong on that one, and now we're on to the next book.
Right. So the next book, Black Faces in High Places. And do you have an estimated release date for that?
I think our estimate is Black History Month 2021. Our manuscript is due, I think, in November, and we're behind right now. We need to catch up. And knowing the publishing cycle, as I believe we do, we're probably looking at best a late 2020, at best an early 2021 release of the book. But we're really excited about this project. The first book was very well received, and we've gotten consistent positive feedback. It went paperback and the like. But this second book is really a continuation of the conversation that we've been having about how do you navigate these environments. And I would contrast the two works to say that the first book is about how do you get to the top, and the second book is how do you stay at the top.
Mm-hmm. And, so thinking about the books, I mean, it was your target audience. I could see benefit. Imagine a lot of your target was providing advice to, let's say, Black students and Black people who are early in their career. But then as a white reader, there was a certain kind, perspective sharing that was certainly interesting and helpful. But, I was wondering if you could touch on that, or, something else I wanted to ask. Thinking, turning white places into more inclusive places. What do white people need to do? Because that burden, I think, falls here. And part of my discomfort, I don't even like to call myself a white person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So forgive my awkwardness over stumbling through a question there. But what are your thoughts there? I guess I was asking about, target audience for the book, but then that other question of what can we do to help create more inclusive workplaces?
Which one you want to take there, Randall? Number one or number two? I'll follow you. You can pick, and then I'll pick up what's left.
Well, the book certainly has an audience with Black professionals from different sectors of the economy. Mm-hmm. But we also know that the book has been useful for whites who read it, or for people of other ethnic backgrounds who read the book. They want to get a perspective. We wrote a book from a distinctly Black perspective, and we from our own experience and experience of others. But it certainly has application to others. The principles and thoughts, the strategies certainly apply to anybody who's been in that situation where they're the one or the only one, or they get to a certain, in our new book context, getting to a certain part of the organization, the higher heights, and asking themselves the question, am I, what are my responsibilities? What am I, how do I think about getting here, and then how do I think about staying here? How do I think about the people who are coming behind me? And so, those are some of the themes that I'm sure many people will resonate with. But again, we wrote it with the Black community of professionals in mind.
Sure. No, absolutely. And to the second question of how do we create more inclusive workplaces, I would distill it into three steps, and I'm thinking about, organizations in particular, but let me actually contextualize it two ways. I think from an individual perspective, it begins with us. We have to do the work of educating ourselves on issues of equity. And part of that is kind of introspection, raising our awareness of our biases. We talk about cultural competence as being comprised of 4 components: cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural skills, and cultural encounters. Building your awareness of your biases, building your knowledge of different cultures, building your skills around cross-cultural communication, negotiation, conflict resolution, and then challenging yourself to move beyond your comfort zone to have encounters with difference. And you can take that along any lines: different religions, different ideologies, different ethnicities, different cultures, different languages, et cetera, different political ideologies, et cetera, et cetera. That's the individual conversation. The organizational one is about assessment, alignment, and action. Let's assess where we are. Each organization has a different profile of where it has strengths and where it has limitations. But let's get the evidence to know what we need to measure so we can manage ourselves towards improving. Like we would any other initiative, whether it's marketing or sales or operations, we get the data to build the case, to build a plan. And so the assessment to the alignment to let's build a plan that aligns with our organizational identity, mission, vision, values, and our strategic direction so that we can get leadership buy-in. We can get the business case for how this can add value. We can have alignment across all levels of the organization so that we're galvanized to facilitate transformative cultural change. And then let's take action. Like any other initiative, let's do the training, let's hold the town halls, let's expand our recruiting partnerships. Let's analyze our pipeline to figure out where we have attrition and so that we can bolster our efforts. And let's just take action to feed back to where we started, which is the evidence so that we're measuring ourselves. And you can appreciate this, Mark, because I know where you come from, continuous improvement, right? I know you've talked about that more than once on this program, continuous improvement.
Right. Well, so with improvement often comes talk of innovation. And Jeff, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your work at Rutgers Business School and trying to help in the innovation economy, helping that be more inclusive. And is there also a real business case?
Oh, yes. Great. I'm glad you started that way. I mean, there's certainly, a social justice imperative to these things, but let's talk about the economic imperative here. You have to think about this in a micro sense and a macro sense. So in the micro sense, there's inclusive teams, diverse teams can outperform, can be more creative than teams that just have just monochromatic or that are monolithic in some ways. There's not only is there groupthink that goes on there, you don't get to the most creative solutions, but you can make those big faux pas, I've seen all kinds of companies make these major mistakes in terms of how they advertise and market their products or how they are engaging the people who they want to buy the products because they didn't have a diverse team engaged in putting together the plan. I mean those are facts. There's lots of research studies that talk about diverse teams and the value of diversity in terms of a business case and getting to the best solutions, but especially in creative work and especially in work where those different perspectives can be valued and utilized. I mean, there's a specific case there. On the macro side of things, you can't maintain the sort of national innovation edge that we have right now in the United States without engaging the energies, the efforts of all the people in the U.S. As demographics begin to change, if we're only relying upon white males as the sort of generator of innovation, that's going to leave us in a really bad place. So what we need to be doing is making sure that innovation includes everybody, that it includes women, that it includes people of color, that it includes people with different perspectives and brings them to the table, not only to create better products or better technologies, but also to engage in the long haul in promoting and creating this innovation economy. So that's the economic case. That's the business case. And a lot of my work at Rutgers these days is around thinking about that in tech firms and venture firms and sort of the STEM pipeline, but certainly in how we fund and support innovation in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one other way looking at it, if you are selling products to a very diverse market,
absolutely,
not having a team that's not diverse is going to create blind spots in what you think or know what you think you know the market wants in different ways.
That's right. Right. That's absolutely right.
Well, really want to thank both of you, and I do want to make the point, just bringing it back to The Apprentice once more, for anyone who would accuse Randal of not sharing. I had reached out and asked Randal to do the podcast, and very immediately he said we should share that with Jeff. So, I mean,
that's right.
your character coming through there in terms of, my gosh, willingness to share. But really appreciate letting me ask some questions, even if they come from a place of awkwardly trying to figure out and trying to learn. So thank you for allowing that, and for being guests here today, and what I know are very busy schedules. So our guests have been Dr. Randal Pinkett and Dr. Jeffrey Robinson. Is there anything else I can give you the last word, if there's any other final thought you might want to share with the audience here?
Yeah, I will say this to continue the thread that you laid out, and say this is how change occurs. It's through dialogue, and it's through moving beyond our comfort zone into our growth zone. And so I say all the time, and I'm going to say it now, lean into that discomfort, Mark, because that means you're growing. And that means you're a better person today than the one you were yesterday. So don't see the discomfort as bad. Not that you said that you saw it as bad, but rather I'm excited to know that you've challenged yourself to have this conversation. And even if it was at times awkward or difficult to navigate, you flexed your muscle of cultural competence, which means it's now stronger. And you can test it out in, one-on-ones, and then 2-on-ones, and then next thing you know, it's 100-on-1, where you're able to find your voice in greater measure. Because to get back to where I started with one of your early questions, talking about the moment now where white people may be more reticent, we need your voices now more than ever. And so I thank you, not just for the invitation, but I thank you for your voice, and for engaging in this dialogue and moving us all from our comfort zone into our growth zone. So thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Well, thanks. And in my defense, I can be plenty awkward talking about just about anything. And I don't worry about that reflecting badly on all MIT graduates or on all white people. So,
equal opportunity.
Jeff, is there anything else that you would?
No, I think Randal said it well. We thank you for having us on the show.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.